What kind of woman could move an army of bikers without saying a single word? That's what the people of Brooksville still ask themselves whenever they hear the thunder of engines echoing through their quiet little town. A sound that, once upon a time, didn't mean fear, but justice. Because that night when hundreds of bikers rode down Route 67, it wasn't for rebellion, or noise, or pride. It was for a poor widow who had been humiliated at a gas station. You can almost see it, the silver sky. Before dusk, the road shimmering under the last light of day, and the gentle figure of an elderly woman counting coins at the counter. Her name was Martha, 72 years old, hands trembling, eyes tired but kind. She wasn't there to ask for pity. She only wanted a few gallons of gas to keep her old pickup running. Yet what she got instead was mockery, laughter, cruelty from a young cashier who thought her worth could be measured by the change in her palm. Have you ever witnessed something so unfair that your chest burned with anger, even if it had nothing to do with you? That's exactly what happened next. Hidden behind the sound of clinking coins and muffled laughter, someone else was watching, a biker named Jack Lawson, known on the road as Reaper. To the world he looked dangerous, leather jacket, steel eyes, scars that told stories no one dared to ask about. But beneath the rough skin was a man who had once lost everything, including his mother, a widow, just like Martha. When Jack saw that old woman's humiliation, something inside him broke, and something else awakened. It's in moments like that, when the weak are mocked, that true strength reveals itself. Because justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a patch. What you're about to discover now may surprise you, because this story isn't just about an old woman and a rude cashier. It's about what happens when humanity fights back, when compassion roars louder than cruelty, when men with broken pasts find a way to protect the light that still survives in others. Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just a story. It's a mirror, a reflection of what happens when decency seems to vanish and then suddenly returns, carried by the roar of engines and the beating hearts of those who refuse to look away. That night, the gas station lights flickered under the hum of approaching thunder. The town didn't know yet what was coming, the rhythm of hundreds of motorcycles rolling like a storm across the asphalt, each headlight cutting through the dark like a blade of truth, and in the middle of it all, a single voice rising above the wind, not out of rage but out of honor. It started with one act of kindness, one man who refused to stay silent, and what followed would turn an ordinary night into a legend of redemption, respect, and brotherhood. Because even on the darkest roads of America, there are still men who carry something greater than vengeance inside their hearts. They carry memory, loyalty, and an unspoken promise to protect those who can't fight for themselves. And that night, when the world forgot how to be kind, the sound of engines reminded everyone what it truly means to be human. Now, listen closely, because what happened next at that lonely gas station changed everything. Have you ever seen kindness powerful enough to silence a crowd? Because that night in Brooksville, when the engines started to roar, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And before we ride deeper into what happened next, I want you to take a moment, just a breath, to feel what this story stirs in you. Does it remind you of a moment when someone stood up for you? Or maybe a time when you wish someone had? If this story is already reaching something inside you, don't let it stay silent. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your words matter more than you think. When you share what you feel, you're not just writing a comment. You're helping build a space where empathy still has a voice. That's what this channel is all about. Stories that remind us there's still light on the darkest roads and that compassion can echo louder than hate. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, stories that heal, that remind, that awaken, then hit that like button. It might seem like a small gesture, but it's one that helps these stories travel farther to people who may need them tonight more than you'll ever know. Every click, every like, every comment becomes part of This mission, to spread reminders that justice and humanity are not lost. If you're new here, or if this is the first time you've stumbled across this kind of story, I'd be honored if you joined this growing community. Subscribe, and let's keep walking this road together, one story at a time. Each week we explore what it means to stand up when the world turns cold, and to find hope in places most people have already given up on. Your presence here makes that possible, because in the end, this channel isn't about algorithms or numbers. It's about people like you, people who still believe that even when everything goes quiet, someone, somewhere, will hear the sound of engines in the distance and remember what it means to care. So, stay close, keep listening, because what's coming next will show you how one man's act of courage sparked something no one in that town could ever forget. The moment when a simple gesture became a movement, and when justice arrived, not in silence, but in thunder. The morning light crept slowly across the small kitchen window of a weathered house on the outskirts of Brooksville. The curtains were thin, the color of dust and time, and the soft hum of a radio filled the silence with the faint melody of an old country song. Martha Jensen stood by the table, her back slightly bent, the years of solitude etched into the way she moved. She was 72 and had lived most of her life in this same house, a place once filled with laughter, boots by the door, and the warm smell of coffee her husband used to make before sunrise. But since Frank passed, the rooms had grown quiet, too quiet. She opened an old glass jar sitting by the window, the one where she saved her spare coins. Nickels, dimes, and quarters she found in couch cushions or at the bottom of her purse. The coins clinked as they fell into her wrinkled palm, the sound sharp and lonely in the small room. She counted them twice, whispering softly, "It's enough for a few gallons, maybe." The whisper wasn't for anyone in particular. Maybe for Frank, maybe for the empty space he'd left behind. Her truck sat outside, an old blue Ford pickup that hadn't been washed in months. The paint was chipped, the bumper slightly rusted, but the engine still coughed to life when she turned the key. It was Frank's truck, the one he'd driven to his shifts at the paper mill before his illness. Martha never thought of selling it. Some things, no matter how heavy they become, are too sacred to let go. As she drove down the empty two-lane road, the world outside was just waking up. A few birds cutting across the sky, a dog chasing shadows on a front lawn, the sun pushing through the fog like a slow exhale. Martha rolled down the window to let the morning air in, cool and alive, brushing against her lined face. She felt something rare in that moment, a small pulse of peace, the kind that hides beneath the noise of daily struggle. But peace never lasts long when you live on the edge of scarcity. The fuel gauge had been blinking red since yesterday, and she knew today she couldn't delay it anymore. The gas station wasn't far, maybe 6 miles from home, but for Martha, every decision was a calculation. How much she could spend, how much she could save, and how much pride she could afford to lose in the process. Inside the gas station, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, cold and unforgiving. The air smelled of coffee, oil, and a kind of loneliness that clings to places where strangers come and go without really seeing each other. Martha placed her purse on the counter and began to empty the coins carefully, stacking them in small towers the way she used to when she taught her son to count years ago. The cashier, a young man with earbuds in, barely looked up. When he finally did, he smirked. "You're paying with this," he said, letting the coins spill back onto the counter. The sound was sharp, metallic, cruel. A few people in line chuckled under their breath. Martha's cheeks flushed. "It's all I have," she said softly, trying to hold her dignity together. "It should cover a few gallons." The boy behind the counter laughed louder this time. "Lady, you could have just asked for charity. Would have saved us both time." He didn't see her shaking hands, didn't hear the tremor in her voice as she whispered, "I'm not asking for charity, young man. I'm paying." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a life lived in quiet perseverance, a life where every coin was earned with care and humility, Outside, the morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. A few motorcycles stood parked near the edge of the lot, their engines cooling, chrome catching the light. One of the riders leaned against his bike, watching the scene through the glass door. His name was Jack Lawson, but most people knew him as Reaper. Years of road dust, scars, and silence had hardened him, but what he saw inside the store began to melt. Something deep within, a forgotten ache that had been buried for too long. Jack had seen injustice before. He'd seen the world mock the weak, kick the downed, and call it entertainment. He used to be part of that noise once, before life broke him enough to teach him compassion. The widow's trembling hands reminded him of his mother, how she used to stand in grocery lines after his father's accident, counting food stamps while pretending not to notice the stares behind her. That memory hit like a punch to the gut. He took a slow breath, eyes narrowing as he pushed the door open. The small bell above it jingled, but no one turned around. "How much is it?" he asked the cashier, voice calm but heavy. The boy shrugged. "Doesn't matter, she's short." Jack reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded bill and laid it on the counter. "It matters now," he said. "Fill her tank." For a moment, the room went still. Martha looked up, startled. "Sir, you don't need to—" He raised a hand gently, cutting her off. "Ma'am, I know," he said, "but the world's got enough people laughing at the wrong things." The way he said it wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet, almost tired, like a man who had seen too much and still chose to believe in decency. The cashier swallowed his laughter. He pumped the gas without another word. Martha stood there, unsure what to say, and Jack gave her a faint nod before heading back to his bike. As he stepped outside, the sunlight hit the black paint of his Harley, the road humming beneath him like an invitation. She watched him leave, the sound of his engine fading into the wind. That moment could have ended there, just another small act of kindness lost in the noise of everyday life. But sometimes kindness doesn't fade. It echoes. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Someone in the store had filmed it, posted it online, captioned with a mix of ridicule and irony. "Old lady pays with pennies. Biker steps in. Welcome to Brooksville." They didn't realize that the laughter would soon turn into something else entirely. By nightfall, the clip had reached more than just a few phones. It landed in the private chat groups of local biker clubs across the state. Men who hadn't spoken in years began calling one another brothers, fathers, veterans, the kind of men who understood loss and loyalty better than most. And somewhere along those digital roads, a decision was made. Justice wasn't going to come from humiliation, it would come from presence. That's the thing about moments like this. They start small, like a spark in dry grass, and then they spread beyond what anyone expects. One simple gesture can shift an entire mindset, reminding people of what really matters. It's strange how the world works. Sometimes, the ones society fears are the ones who restore its balance. While most of the town slept, the sound of engines began to roll in from distant highways, growing louder with each mile. But for now, as the last of the daylight slipped, behind the hills, Martha sat by her window again, the same jar of coins beside her, unaware that her quiet act of courage had already begun to move mountains. Her life had always been simple: survival, memory, small hopes. Yet something had changed in the air that day. A hidden truth had started to unfold, and its impact would reach far beyond the edges of her little town. Outside, in the darkness, the roads were no longer empty. The night was alive again, and the sound of engines carried a promise. The Route 67 gas stop sat at the edge of town like a forgotten landmark, its neon sign flickering between half-lit letters and static hums. It was the kind of place people passed through without remembering, just another stop on a long American road, surrounded by cracked asphalt and the scent of gasoline that never truly left the air. The afternoon sun hung low, spilling warm light across the lot, catching the edges of dusty windshields and chrome bumpers. Inside, the air was cool and stale, filled with the faint buzz of the old refrigerator near the counter. Martha pushed the glass door open, its hinge creaking like a sigh. The world outside had been quiet, but in here, every sound carried weight. The shuffle of her shoes, the clinking of coins in her purse, the indifferent rhythm of a young man's gum chewing behind the register. His name tag read, Tyler. He was 20, maybe 21, with messy blonde hair and the easy arrogance of someone who believed youth would last forever. Two of his friends leaned against the snack rack, laughing at something on their phones, not bothering to lower their voices. Martha smiled politely as she approached the counter. "Good afternoon, son," she said softly, setting down her purse. Her voice trembled with that mix of kindness and exhaustion that only time can shape. She reached into the small bag and began pulling out coins, quarters, dimes, even a few nickels, stacking them carefully beside the register. The sound of metal against metal echoed like a clock, ticking too loudly. Tyler glanced at the pile, then at her, his smirk already forming. "You're paying with that?" he asked, dragging out the word that as if it carried a bad smell. His friends snickered. Martha didn't flinch. "Yes," she said, "it should be enough for a few gallons." Her hands trembled slightly, but her tone was calm, dignified. She'd learned long ago that keeping your voice steady was the only armor you could wear when the world tried to make. "You small," but Tyler wasn't listening. He rolled his eyes and leaned closer to his friends. "Guess it's true what they say. Some folks can't let go of the past," he said, pretending to whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, slicing through the air like broken glass. Martha kept her eyes on the coins. She didn't want to see the mockery in their faces. "Just ring it up, please," she whispered. Behind her, a man coughed. The sound came from the back corner of the store, where a biker in a worn leather jacket stood by the coffee machine. Jack Lawson had been there for maybe 5 minutes, enough to catch every word. He hadn't come looking for trouble. He was just passing through, fueling up before the long ride west. But some things have a way of calling you in, the kind of moments that test who you are when no one's watching. He watched Martha's shoulders tremble slightly as she waited for her change. The humiliation, sitting heavy in the air. Jack knew that feeling, the sting of being invisible in a room full of people pretending not to see. He thought of his mother again, of how she used to fold her hands when people spoke down to her, trying to hide the shame. He had promised himself years ago that he'd never stand by in silence again. Tyler shoved the coins back toward her. "You're short," he said, grinning. "Maybe you can go dig through your car seats. I'm sure you'll find another dime or two." The boys laughed again, and that was the moment Jack moved. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his coffee cup down and walked to the counter. The air shifted. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade. "How much does she owe?" Jack asked, his voice low, almost too calm. Tyler looked up, trying to assess him. The tattoos on his hands, the scar under his eye, the steady, dangerous stillness that surrounded him. "Who's asking?" he said. Jack didn't answer. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, laying it flat on the counter. "Fill her tank," he said, "and keep the change." Tyler's smirk faltered. "You don't have to do that, man," he said, suddenly unsure. She can stand here and be treated with respect," Jack interrupted. "Or I can make sure your manager explains what happens when a customer's humiliated in your store." His tone wasn't threatening, but it carried weight, the kind of authority that comes not from power, but from conviction. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, I can't let you do that," she whispered. Jack turned toward her, his expression softening. "Ma'am, it's just gas," he said. "But what you gave them was worth a lot more than that." He didn't explain what he meant, but she understood. It was the quiet kind of understanding that passes between people who've known pain and survived it. The other customers said nothing. Some looked away. Others stared, caught between guilt and admiration. Tyler swallowed hard, finally, mumbling, "Okay," before turning to the pump controls. The laughter had vanished. All that remained was the sound of coins, still sitting on the counter. evidence of a small humiliation turned lesson. Jack followed her outside. The wind had picked up, stirring dust across the lot. Martha looked at him, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to step in," she said. "I've been through worse." Jack nodded. "Maybe," he said, "but you shouldn't have to go through it alone." He helped her steady the fuel nozzle, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. "The world forgets people like you," he added quietly, "and sometimes it needs a reminder." As the gas flowed into the tank, Martha looked at him for a long moment. "My husband was a soldier," she said suddenly, as if needing to fill the silence. "Vietnam. He used to say that decency isn't loud. It's something you do when no one's looking." Jack smiled faintly. "Smart man," he said. "Sounds like someone I would have liked to ride with." When the tank was full, he replaced the nozzle and tipped his head in a small gesture of respect. Martha tried to offer him the coins again, insisting, "Please at least take this." But he just closed her hand around them. "Keep it," he said. "Maybe use it for something that makes you smile." She wanted to ask his name, but by the time she looked up again, he was already walking toward his bike. The engine started with a growl that seemed to echo across the empty fields, the kind of sound that stays with you long after it fades. Martha watched as he disappeared down the highway, leaving behind only the faint smell of gasoline and the ghost of kindness in the air. She stood there for a while, staring at the road, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, seen. Back inside, Tyler pretended to clean the counter, his hands shaking just enough to betray the guilt settling in. His friends had already left, their laughter replaced by awkward silence. He didn't realize that someone else in the store had filmed everything. The widow's trembling hands, his mocking tone, the biker's quiet intervention. By nightfall, the video would be everywhere, sparking a chain of reactions that none of them could have predicted. But in that moment, all that mattered was the truth unfolding quietly between two strangers. A truth about respect, about small decisions that reveal who we really are, and about how one act of compassion can ripple farther than any of us ever imagine. As the last light of day slipped behind the distant hills, the sign outside the gas station flickered once more, as if the world itself had blinked. The wind carried the faint echo of a motorcycle far down the road, merging with the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. And somewhere beyond that horizon, the story of what had just happened was already beginning to travel, an unseen current that would soon grow into something far larger than any of them could yet understand. Jack Reaper Lawson noticed the tremor before he noticed the tears. The old woman's hands, the way the coins shivered on the counter beneath the fluorescent light, those details arrived like a cold wind through a cracked door. He had come in for coffee, nothing more. The road west was waiting, a long stripe of heat and distance, and his plan was simple. Fill the tank, swallow the caffeine, keep moving. But plans aren't stronger than memory, and memory has a way of showing its face when the world crosses a line. From the back corner, near the coffee machine, he stood with the paper cup warming his palm and watched the scene unfold. The cashier's smirk, the boy's careless snickers, the small collapse happening in the widow's chest, even as she stood upright. He didn't think of it as heroism or vengeance or even intervention. It was something older than those words, something learned before he ever swung a leg over a motorcycle. How to see the hidden truth in a room, the story behind the posture, the weight behind the voice. That tries to sound steady. He had grown up in places where the floor creaked in winter and the refrigerator wore a halo of frost. He understood the choreography of scarcity, the counting, the recounting, the decision to go without so someone else could have enough. His mother was the first widow he ever knew intimately. She became one the night the truck did not make the curve and a state trooper cleared his throat on their porch. Jack still remembered her hands at the grocery store years. Later, the quiet ceremony of laying coupons on the counter, her touch gentle as if paper could bruise. When she grew old, she counted coins, not because she was helpless, but because dignity and discipline had become her mindset, the only shield that never failed her. Watching Martha Jensen do the same, he felt a fault line shift. The past wasn't a memory, it was a mirror. He took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. He knew the profile of the young cashier without meeting his eyes. This vast laugh, the borrowed cruelty, the small stage built by boredom and an audience of friends. Tyler believed that moments didn't matter because there would always be another day, another joke, another anonymous face to push around. Jack knew better. Some decisions haunt you. Some are tattoos on your character, inked whether you want them or not. He had earned his scars in louder places than a gas station, but scars don't measure volume, they measure impact. There was a revelation in Tyler's voice, and it wasn't about coins or time. It was about blindness. Jack's own journey had been messy. There were years you could chart by the stains on his jacket and the miles under his belt. Years when trouble was easier to find than sleep. He'd worked roofs, hung drywall, hauled freight, and ridden in packs that solved problems with fists before words. Somewhere along that road he learned the behind-the-scenes economy of respect, how it circulates like oxygen until someone poisons the air. "You're holding up the line, Grandma," Tyler had said, and something inside Jack tightened with a precision that felt ritual. His jaw locked the way it did when he kept himself from saying what lived at the back of his throat. "Not this time. Not on my watch." The thought wasn't dramatic, it was automatic. When people later tried to turn him into a symbol, when the video spun and strangers wrote paragraphs under his face about redemption, Jack laughed and shook his head. He didn't carry a banner. He carried a memory. That was the motor. It wasn't rage that pushed him off the wall and toward the counter. It was grief matured into discipline. "I remember those hands," he would have said if anyone had asked. "I remember my mother's hands." Instead, he set down the cup, felt the delicate tremor in the room shift as the bell on the door chimed against silence, and walked to the register with the slow, measured pace of someone who refuses to let adrenaline take the wheel. He had learned, over years and mistakes, that speed was not strength, clarity was. Tyler's eyes flicked up, trying to measure the threat. The boy saw what people always saw when they looked at Jack, the map of old fights along his knuckles, the faded ink of a club he didn't ride with anymore, the careful quiet that sits in a man who's lost too much. Jack let him see it. He wanted the contrast to do some work, the hidden truth that the rough-looking stranger might be the only one in the room invested in decency. He didn't have to raise his voice to change the gravity. All he had to do was put the bill down and name the standard. "Fill her tank," he said, and the syllables landed with the finality of a sealed envelope. He didn't look at Martha first. He looked at the coins. He saw the stacks, not as shortage but as testament, little towers of resolve built 1 quarter at a time. "I'm paying," she had said, and he believed her. His mother had taught him the difference between charity and honor. Charity puts you below. Honor puts you beside. He wasn't there to replace her sum with his. He was there to relocate the conversation from mockery to respect. "I'll cover the rest," he added, and turned toward her only when the moment had been repaired. Her eyes were damp but steady, a window into a life that had not asked for sympathy, only a fair exchange. "Thank you," she whispered, more out of courtesy than weakness. "I get it," Jack said, keeping his voice low. "Been there." The words were plain, but they carried a whole archive. The phone calls that never came, the years when decisions felt like tightropes, the way relief arrives quietly and leaves the same way. He knew the temptation to make a scene, to force an apology, or extract a performance of guilt from the kid behind the counter. It would feel good for a minute and fix nothing by morning. This wasn't about winning a shout. It was about resetting the room's compass so that tomorrow a different choice might look possible. Transformation doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it's the result of a small pivot, invisible to everyone, but decisive in its trajectory. His mother's voice drifted through him. "Never your temper first, always your purpose." He slid the 20 forward and kept his hands open, an old habit from newer times when motion could be misread. "Respect," he said almost to himself, as if naming the air he wanted everyone to breathe. The boy behind the counter blinked, the edges of his smirk softening into something like uncertainty. Shame is volatile. It can explode or evaporate. Jack watched him make a decision in the tight space of a second. The kid hit the pump switch. The money drawer clicked. A thin apology sat at the edge of his mouth, but Jack didn't harvest it. Forgiveness isn't a trophy. It's a door you leave cracked for the future. Outside, the light had tilted toward evening, gold stretching across the lot and turning the dust into glitter. Jack walked with Martha to the pump. Up close, he saw the careful way she held herself upright, a posture built on decades of refusing to collapse. "I can manage," she said, reaching for the nozzle. "I know you can," he answered, handing it to her anyway, a small courtesy that felt like balance instead of rescue. The pump stuttered, then hummed. Gasoline flowed. Time slowed to the metronome of a digital counter. He didn't rush. Presence was the whole point. "My Frank used to do this," she said, eyes on the numbers as if they were a clock rewinding. "He'd say, 'Full tank, full heart, Ma.' He was a veteran, not much of a talker, but he believed in people. I'm trying to keep believing, too." Jack let the words hang. He didn't insert his history into hers. Still, one sentence slipped free before he could stop it. "My ma counted coins, too," he said. "She taught me the math of dignity. It wasn't a confession, just coordinates." Martha turned, studied his face as if it carried a map. "You're a good man," she said quietly. Jack shook his head once. "I'm trying to be a better one," he replied. The pump clicked. He set the nozzle back, habitually wiping the handle with the edge of his sleeve. Rituals like that kept the chaos at bay. Behind them, the glass door reflected the lot like a thin mirror. The bikes, the trucks, the scarecrow of a man smoking near the ice machine. Jack saw the reflection of his own outline and registered the gap between what strangers assumed and what he knew to be true. The leather, the scars, the road. These were trappings. The engine underneath was a set of promises, some he'd kept, some he'd broken, all of them still binding. This encounter wasn't an isolated kindness. It was a correction to his own story, a recalibration of who he wanted to be on a Wednesday he would have otherwise forgotten. He didn't give Martha his name. Names invite mythology, and he was allergic to that. He gave her a nod that meant more than thank you and less than goodbye. She pressed the coins toward him a second time. "Please," she said, "take it for the coffee." He closed her fingers gently and shook his head. "Save it for something sweet," he said, "something that changes the taste of the day." She smiled. In that way sorrow learns, small but luminous. He started the bike. The engine's first thunder rolled across the asphalt, a low testament that drew a few eyes without demanding anyone's attention. He pulled onto Route 67 with no flourish, a dark line stitching into the light. He should have vanished the way travelers do, a blur swallowed by distance. But distance does not blunt everything. As he rode, the scene replayed in his mind with stubborn clarity, like a film you watch twice to catch the details. A folded bill, a trembling hand, a boy's decision at a register, the quiet ceremony of filling a tank. He felt the old ache travel with him, but something else traveled too, a new alignment, a cleaner horizon in his chest. He didn't call it redemption, he called it maintenance. You don't become the man you want to be once. You become him in increments, at counters and curbs, in the ordinary weather of a day. Miles later, he pulled off at a turnout just past the county line. The world had opened into fields and long sky. He killed the engine and listened to the wind drag along the grass like a hand. In the phone's black glass, his reflection hovered over the last notification. A local feed, a video thumbnail from the gas station, a freeze frame of a woman's coins on a counter. He almost ignored it. He wasn't interested in becoming content, but the comments caught his eye, some cruel, some soft, some unsure, the raw calculus of a town deciding what it thinks of itself. He scrolled without liking, without signing his name into the crowd, and yet he felt the current beneath the noise, the way a story chooses its direction the moment someone chooses to care. He typed a single message to a man listed in his phone only as Burke, a brother-in-arms from other roads. The kind you call when your compass needs a second needle. No speeches, no swagger, just coordinates and context. Brooksville. Widow disrespected at Route 67 gas stop, not for a fight, for presence. He didn't hit send right away. He let the wind argue with him, let caution and pride present their cases like old lawyers. The decision wasn't about anger. It was about the impact a moment could have if enough boots touched the same ground. In the end, he trusted the equation his life kept teaching. Him, compound decency and the outcome shifts. He pressed send. Somewhere far off, thunder teased the edges of the sky, though the forecast promised clear weather. Jack slipped the phone back into his jacket and restarted the bike, the sound of the engine folding into the empty road as if answering a call. The day's light thinned toward evening, and the stripe of asphalt ahead became a quiet corridor, where one man's choice could travel farther than he ever planned. Back at the station, the neon would keep flickering, and a young cashier would keep replaying a conversation he wished he could edit. In a neat house on the outskirts of town, an elderly widow would set a jar of coins back on the windowsill with hands that felt, for the first time in a long time, steady, and as mile markers ticked by, the ripples of a simple act gathered speed, building into a hum that would invite other engines to answer it, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder of what it sounded like when respect arrived. Together. The $20 bill didn't look like much when Jack set it on the counter, but the weight behind it changed the temperature of the room. For a second, the fluorescent hum above them seemed to fade, and all that was left was silence thick enough to taste. Tyler stared at the bill, trying to calculate whether this stranger was bluffing, whether that calm voice hid something dangerous. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jack's eyes stopped him cold. Blue-gray, flat as weathered steel, the kind of look that doesn't invite argument. There was no threat in it, only finality, like a man who'd already made his decision and didn't need permission to act on it. "Fill a tank," Jack said again, quieter this time, but somehow louder than before. The words didn't ask, they declared. Tyler hesitated, then reached for the pump switch, mumbling something about company policy. But Jack didn't even blink. The boy's sneer faltered, falling into the kind of awkward half-smile people wear when they realize they've just been seen for who they are. Behind him, one of his friends pretended to check his phone, suddenly fascinated by the screen. Martha stood frozen beside the counter, still clutching her coin purse like a shield. "Sir, you don't need to do that," she said, her voice trembling. "It's kind of you, but Jack turned toward her slowly. His expression softened, the lines of age and road dust shifting into something almost gentle. "Ma'am," he said, "you don't owe me a thing. The world does." It wasn't a line meant to impress anyone. It was truth, simple, bare, and earned through years of learning how cruel the world could be to the quiet ones. He reached out, resting his hand briefly on the counter as if to steady the moment itself, then turned back toward the door. The bell above it jingled again, that same sound that had marked his entrance minutes before, but now it carried something different, like punctuation. Martha stood there for a moment, speechless. Then she exhaled, slow and shaking, and followed him out, the air outside warm and filled with dust and gasoline. He waited by her old pickup truck, leaning against the side panel as she approached. "Let me help you with that," he said, taking the nozzle from her small hands. She wanted to refuse, but there was something grounding in his presence, unpolished, solid, the kind of steadiness that had become rare in her world. He filled the tank in silence, watching the numbers climb on the meter. The steady click of the pump seemed to measure more than fuel. It measured time, distance, the slow unraveling of humiliation into something like restoration. "I don't know how to thank you," she said after a long pause. "You don't even know me." He gave a faint smile, his gaze still fixed on the fuel gauge. "Maybe I don't need to," he said. "Sometimes Knowing what's right is enough. Then he added, almost to himself, "My mum used to say, you can tell the state of the world by how it treats its widows." Guess she was right. Martha blinked back tears she didn't want him to see. "You remind me of my husband," she said quietly. He had that same look in his eyes when someone crossed a line. Jack didn't answer at first. The hum of the pump filled the silence again, and a soft wind lifted the edge of his jacket. "I've crossed plenty myself," he admitted, "but some things, you can't watch and do nothing." He pulled the nozzle free, twisting the cap back on the tank. "It's just a tank." "Of gas, ma'am. No debt here." She wanted to say more, something about gratitude, about how rare people like him had become, but her voice caught. He closed the gas cap with a click that echoed louder than it should have, then stepped back and nodded once, a gesture both farewell and reassurance. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and don't let the world make you think you're small." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You too." He climbed onto his bike, black and worn, but still beautiful in its own way, an extension of him, raw and real. When the engine roared to life, the sound rolled across the parking lot like thunder before rain. The other customers looked up from their phones and coffee cups, startled. It wasn't the noise that caught them, it was the certainty in it, the kind of certainty you can't fake. Martha stood there as he pulled away, the tail light glowing red against the lowering sun. The wind from his departure brushed against her face, carrying with it the faint smell of oil and something else, freedom maybe, or the memory of it. For the first time in months, she felt her spine straighten. The shame that had clung to her shoulders began to slip away, replaced by something unfamiliar yet welcome, dignity reborn. Inside, Tyler wiped the counter with the back of his hand, avoiding the eyes of the other customers. He wasn't laughing anymore. The store suddenly felt too bright, too exposed. He caught his reflection in the glass of the cooler door and barely recognized it. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered under his breath, but there was no one left to answer. The cameras above the register kept their silent vigil, recording everything as they always did. Tyler didn't think about it until later, when he realized that the internet doesn't sleep, and moments like this, moments soaked in truth, don't stay hidden for long. A customer waiting by the door had filmed the whole thing on his phone. The clip wasn't framed well, the lighting was bad, and the sound was grainy, but it didn't matter. What it captured was raw humanity, the kind people didn't expect anymore. By nightfall, the video had spread farther than anyone could have predicted. People shared it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. The comments flooded in, some angry, some moved, some ashamed. "That biker had more class than half this country," one read. Another said, "We need more men like him." But the one that stuck was simple. He didn't just pay for gas. He reminded us what decency looks like. Jack didn't know any of this yet. He was miles away by then, the hum of the road his only company. He rode with his thoughts drifting between past and present, between what had happened and what it meant. He didn't ride to escape, he rode to understand. There was a hidden truth in the day's events that tugged at him, something about how one small decision could ignite a chain reaction far beyond intention. He had always believed that people underestimate the quiet power of a single choice. You don't need grand gestures to start transformation, just a moment where conscience outweighs convenience. As he cut through the edge of town, the last light of dusk painted the horizon in bruised colors, purple, orange, and red, bleeding into one another. He thought of his mother again, the way she used to hum when she was worried, and how that sound meant everything was somehow still okay. He didn't hum, but his engine did, low and steady. Every mile was a meditation, every turn a reminder that redemption isn't a finish line. It's maintenance, something you rebuild with every right decision after the wrong ones. He stopped at a red light near the interstate and caught his reflection in a storefront window. For a moment, he saw not the outlaw everyone assumed, but a man still trying to find balance between rage and mercy. He had spent years believing he didn't deserve peace, but maybe peace wasn't something you deserved. It was something you practiced. Back at the gas station, the world kept spinning. Martha drove home slowly, her hands tight on the wheel, the coins still inside her purse like quiet witnesses. When she reached her driveway, she parked and sat in silence for a long time, watching the light fade from her front yard. Somewhere between the loneliness and the relief, she whispered, "Thank you," though no one was there to hear it. Across town, Tyler sat in his car after closing, scrolling through the video that was now everywhere. He watched himself smirking, laughing, mocking, and then he saw Jack step into the frame, the silence before the words that changed everything. "Fill her tank." The look in those eyes made Tyler feel smaller than he ever had before, not because of fear, but because he recognized something he'd lost along the way: integrity. For the first time, he understood that the moment wasn't about him humiliating someone, it was about him being humbled. As the night deepened, the air in Brooksville felt different, subtle but charged. There was a shift happening, not in politics, not in headlines, but in hearts. One act of kindness had started to ripple through unseen corridors of human conscience. People who'd seen the video called their parents, apologized to strangers, tipped a little extra at diners. Not because they were told to, but because the story reminded them how easy it is to choose decency over indifference. And somewhere on a stretch of empty highway, Jack felt that same ripple in his chest. He didn't know why the air felt electric, but he sensed something moving beneath the surface, a stirring he couldn't name yet, as if the road itself was carrying a secret just ahead of him, waiting to be revealed. The hum of his engine deepened, and his eyes lifted toward the horizon where faint thunder began to roll, soft and distant. The sound of engines was multiplying. The first person to post the video didn't mean to start anything. He was just another passerby, leaning on the counter with a soda in his hand, filming what he thought would be a forgettable little scene. An old lady fumbling for change, a bored cashier smirking, a stranger in a leather jacket stepping in. He uploaded it with a sarcastic caption and a couple of laughing emojis. But the internet, unpredictable as wildfire, took it somewhere else entirely. Within an hour, the clip was on half a dozen local Facebook pages. By sunset, it had crossed the invisible threshold that separates gossip from movement. The video opened with the sound of coins clinking on the counter, then zoomed in on Martha's trembling hands. You could hear Tyler's voice, mocking and sharp. "Maybe come back when you can actually afford gas, Grandma." Then came the silence. The kind of silence that forces people to look at themselves, and Jack's low, steady voice. "Fill her tank." That line hit people in the chest like a hammer. The comments exploded beneath the post. "Who is this man?" "That kid needs to be fired." "This broke my heart." And then the one that changed everything. "Anyone know which station this was?" Asking for a friend with a Harley. By late afternoon, the name Route 67 gas stop was trending in small-town forums and biker chat threads. On the surface, it was just another local controversy, but beneath that, something older and more instinctive was stirring. The shared code of loyalty, the silent agreement that some lines aren't meant to be crossed. Bikers from across the state began tagging each other, not for a protest, not for violence, but for presence. "Oh, lady disrespected," one message read. "Route 67, tonight." Phones lit up in garages, diners, and roadside bars. Men with grease under their nails and leather hanging from their shoulders looked at their screens, reading the words twice before replying. For many of them, it wasn't just about the widow. It was about their mothers, their sisters, their wives, every woman who'd been made to feel small in a world that had forgotten grace. Each text sent was like striking a match. "You in?" "Always." The roads began to hum before the sun even set. The sound started faintly, like distant thunder, then grew as engines came alive one by one. Somewhere outside Brooksville, a long row of bikes lined up along the shoulder, engines idling low, exhaust pipes breathing clouds into the cooling air. Jack was at the front, silent, his face half-shadowed beneath the rim of his helmet. He hadn't asked. And for this, hadn't planned it, but the code of the road was older than intention. You don't ignore a call that speaks the language of respect. He didn't see himself as a hero, not even close. "This ain't about me," he muttered to Burke, the first to arrive. "It's about what we stand for." Burke nodded, his own bike rumbling under him. "Doesn't matter, brother. You lit the spark. Now we ride." Back in town, Tyler sat behind the counter, scrolling through his phone with a growing pit in his stomach. The store had emptied out hours ago, but the internet had not. His name wasn't on the video, but his face was. The comments were merciless. Shame on him. This generation has no respect. Maybe he'll learn humility now. He tried to tell himself it was all overblown, just a misunderstanding, but every replay of his own words cut deeper. He didn't sound clever anymore. He sounded cruel. When the first message from a friend arrived, "Bro, you might want to get out of there, the bikers are coming." He thought it was a joke, but then another came, and another. The sky outside had already dimmed, and through the glass doors he noticed the faint reflection of headlights far down the road. At first it was just one or two, then five, then more, spreading across the asphalt like fireflies converging on the same flame. The roads into Brooksville became arteries of noise and motion. Riders came from neighboring towns, from old chapters that hadn't ridden together in years, from places where loyalty still meant something tangible. Some had met Jack once or twice at gatherings, others didn't know his name at all, but they all understood the message. This wasn't revenge, it was a reminder. A woman in a red pickup pulled over at the sound, recording on her phone as the line of motorcycles passed her. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered to the camera, "but it feels important." Her video would later go viral, labeled "The Night Justice Rode into Town, but Right." Then it was just the sound of unity, raw, physical, undeniable. Martha at home didn't know any of this yet. She was sitting at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside her. The coin jar still sat near the window, half empty now, catching the faint light from the street. She thought of the man on the motorcycle, the way his words had carried something more than kindness. A promise, maybe. "You don't owe me a thing. The world does." She didn't know why, but that sentence replayed in her mind like a prayer. On the highway, the horizon turned gold and red as the sun sank lower. The bikes moved like a single organism, headlights glowing, tires kissing the road with precision. Jack felt the vibration in his bones, the synchronized rhythm of engines and heartbeats. It wasn't aggression that fueled them, it was purpose. He thought of how easily people forget their own power to restore balance, how often justice hides not in grand gestures, but in simple, collective decisions. As the convoy neared town, more riders joined from side roads, veterans, mechanics, fathers, even a few women with patches stitched by hand. The message had spread faster than any one of them could have planned. They didn't need to know each other. They only needed to understand why they were there. That was the hidden strength behind it all, the revelation that sometimes the moral fabric of a place can be rewoven overnight if enough people decide it's time. The first drops of rain began to fall as they reached the gas station, dark specks on the pavement glowing under neon light. The store was quiet. Tyler stood inside, frozen, his reflection split by the glass door. Outside, the roar grew until it filled the air like a living thing. Headlights flared, chrome caught the flicker of lightning, and the sound, hundreds of engines idling together, became a pulse that shook the windows. Jack parked first, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate calm. He didn't storm inside, he didn't need to. The silence that followed their arrival was louder than any words could be. Tyler swallowed, the full impact of what he'd done crashing over him. For the first time that day, he felt small. Not because someone had humiliated him, but because he understood how humiliation felt. Jack stood at the entrance, rain sliding down his jacket. He looked through the glass, not with anger, but with something deeper, disappointment maybe. "You ever mock a widow again?" he said evenly, his voice muffled by the rain but clear enough to be heard. You'll have to answer to all of us." Then he turned, glancing over the rows of riders waiting silently behind him. "We're not here for vengeance," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry. "We're here to remind this world what respect looks like when it rides together." The words rolled through the rain like thunder, steady and unbroken. No one cheered, no one shouted. They just stood there, a wall of presence, living proof that decency could still take up space in a world that had grown numb. Tyler nodded slowly, his face pale, eyes wet. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though no one demanded it. Jack didn't linger. He pulled a single red flower from his jacket pocket, a wild bloom he'd picked somewhere along the road, and set it on the counter before walking out. The gesture didn't need explanation. It spoke for itself. He started his bike, the others following suit, and together they rode off into the storm, taillights vanishing, one by one into the dark. Behind them, the station lights flickered in the wet night, and the boy behind the counter stood alone, staring at the flower as if it contained a hidden truth he'd only just begun to understand. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, that quiet reckoning, would mark the start of his own transformation. And while the town slept, the sound of engines rolled far beyond the borders of Brooksville, carrying the story forward, turning it into something bigger than anyone could have planned. A reminder that when respect returns, it often arrives not in whispers, but in thunder. The night settled over Brooksville with the kind of heaviness that precedes a storm. The sky was dark but restless, clouds shifting like slow tides, and the air carried that faint metallic scent that comes before rain. Tyler had been alone for hours, the hum of the refrigerators and the flicker of the neon sign the only company left in the station. Every few minutes he'd glance toward the door, half expecting someone to walk in and shatter the silence. But no one did. The roads were empty. The laughter from earlier that day had long dried up, leaving behind only the echo of his own voice and the memory of her eyes, wet with humiliation. He told himself to forget it. It was just a joke, he thought, pacing behind the counter. People get too sensitive these days. But even as he repeated the lie, the truth refused to quiet down. It played behind his eyes in looping fragments. Her trembling hands, the soft clink of coins, the stranger's voice, steady, controlled, impossible to ignore. "Fill her tank." That sentence had more weight than anything Tyler had said in his 21 years on Earth. And now it echoed through the stillness like a warning he couldn't outrun. He rubbed his palms against his jeans, restless. The clock above the coffee machine clicked past 9. He was almost done closing when it happened. The first sound, distant and low, a vibration so faint he thought it was thunder. But it grew, steady and deliberate, spreading through the ground like a heartbeat. The coffee cups on the counter rattled. The glass doors began to tremble in their frames. Tyler froze. He knew that sound. Everyone did. It was the deep, rolling growl of motorcycles, and not one or two, but dozens. He stepped toward the door, curiosity fighting panic. Far down the highway, the horizon shimmered with points of light. Headlights. At first they looked like fireflies, scattered and harmless, but within seconds they multiplied, a wave of illumination spilling over the asphalt, reflections bouncing off wet pavement. Then the sound hit full force. The rumble wasn't just noise anymore, it was presence. Hundreds of engines, synchronized, powerful, alive. Tyler's throat tightened. "No way," he whispered. "It can't be." But it was. The video, the comments, the threats, they had all blended into something abstract online, easy to dismiss as bluster. But now the internet had taken form, clothed in black leather and chrome, and it was rolling straight toward him. The first bikes appeared at the edge of the lot, headlights cutting through the night like torches. One by one they pulled in, tires crunching against the gravel, engines roaring and then idling in rhythm. The noise was deafening, but somehow controlled, an orchestra of defiance. They parked in perfect formation, rows upon rows, until the entire station was surrounded. The air shimmered with heat and Exhaust and the faint drizzle that had begun to fall hissed against metal, and then he saw him, Jack Lawson, the man from the video, the one whose silence had spoken louder than his words. He was at the front, straddling his bike, helmet off, rain dripping from his jacket. His eyes were fixed on Tyler, not angry, not cruel, just impossibly calm, like someone weighing a decision that had already been made. His arms crossed over his chest, the leather creaking slightly as he shifted his weight. Around him, the others waited, their faces shadowed, their bodies still. The world outside the gas station had fallen away. Inside, Tyler's pulse hammered so loudly he could hear it over the rumble. He tried to breathe, but the air felt too thick. He wanted to run, to lock the door, to disappear, but some instinct told him that running would only make it worse. He stood frozen behind the counter, staring through the glass at the man he had mocked without knowing, the man who had looked at him. Bunsen decided the moment needed to change. Jack dismounted his bike slowly, boots landing on the slick pavement with a dull thud. He walked forward, each step deliberate, the neon light flickering across the patches on his vest. A skull with angel wings. The words Iron Redeemers stitched across the back. The kind of name that sounded half menace, half salvation. The kind of name Tyler suddenly understood. When Jack reached the door, he didn't rush. He just stopped, standing inches away from the glass, his reflection merging with Tyler's. The two men, one seasoned by miles and regret, the other barely out of boyhood, stared at each other across that thin barrier of glass and guilt. Jack's voice, when it came, was low, but clear enough to cut through the storm. "You remember her?" he asked. Tyler swallowed. Yeah, he managed to say. "Good," Jack said. "Then you remember what you did." "I didn't mean—" Jack lifted a hand slightly, silencing him without effort. "Meaning's cheap," he said. "Respect costs more." The words weren't angry. They were surgical, precise. They sliced right through Tyler's excuses and left only the truth. Jack leaned closer, rain running off his hair, and said quietly, "You ever mock someone like that again, you'll answer to more than me." He gestured slightly toward the rows of riders behind him. The rain had grown heavier now, streaking the scene with silver lines of water, but none of the bikers moved. They stood in perfect stillness, like statues cast from the same metal as their machines, chrome under neon, leather gleaming under the soft pulse of red and blue light, engines idling low like an animal breathing. Tyler nodded, the fear giving way to something else. Shame, thick and heavy, burning its way up his throat. "I'm sorry," he said, barely audible. "I was stupid. I didn't think—" Jack's expression didn't change. "You didn't think anyone would notice," he finished for him. "But someone always does." He let the silence stretch for a few seconds before stepping back. "This isn't about ruining you, kid. It's about reminding you. People like her built this country while we were busy breaking it. You don't get to mock that." Behind him, a voice called out from the bikes, deep and resonant. "Preach it, Reaper!" The others murmured in agreement, the sound low but powerful, like a living heartbeat. Jack turned slightly, raising a hand, and the murmurs fell back into silence. He looked over his shoulder once more, scanning the crowd of riders. "We're not here for vengeance," he said, his voice carrying over the rain. "We're here for balance. For every time someone forgets what respect looks like, we remind them." The riders revved their engines once, a single collective growl that shook the ground. The vibrations traveled through the pavement, into the glass, into Tyler's chest. He felt it not as threat, but as message, a physical reminder that words have echoes, and some of them ride on two wheels. Jack turned back to the door, looking at the boy one last time. "Make better choices," he said. "The world's already got enough noise. Be the quiet that makes a difference." Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded $20 bill. He pressed it against the glass, the same gesture he had made earlier that day, only now it was symbolic, the line between cruelty and conscience made visible. He let it fall to the ground, rain plastering it to the pavement, and walked back to his bike. Tyler stood rooted to the spot, watching as Jack swung a leg over the Harley and started the engine. The sound roared back to life, echoed by 100 others. One by one, the riders revved in unison, their headlights flooding the lot with light so bright it looked like daylight had returned for a moment. The noise rose until it wasn't just sound anymore. It was something primal, something ancient, a storm not of weather, but of will. Then, as if responding to an unspoken cue, the front row began to roll forward. The rest followed, each bike pulling away in perfect formation, engines roaring down Route 67 like a river of fire and steel. The sound faded slowly, leaving behind only the hiss of rain on asphalt and the trembling glass doors of the gas station. Inside, Tyler sank into the stool behind the counter, running his hands through his hair. He wasn't shaking from fear anymore. It was something else, realization. He looked at his reflection in the window again and barely recognized the face staring back. "You screwed up," he whispered to himself, "but maybe it's not too late to fix it." Outside, the $20 bill fluttered slightly in the wind, plastered against the wet ground, its edges glowing under the dim neon light, a small reminder of what had happened and what it had awakened. Far down the road, the sound of engines continued to echo through the hills, not angry, not violent, but purposeful. A storm of justice that had come and gone, leaving behind more than fear. It had left understanding, the first fragile seed of transformation, and a quiet town that would never hear the sound of motorcycles the same way again. The air outside the gas station felt heavier than the rain itself, charged, alive, almost vibrating with something bigger than anger. It wasn't chaos, it was order built on conviction, the kind of moment that divides a life into before and after. Tyler could see his own reflection trembling in the glass, split by the neon flicker of the word "open" behind him, even though the store was now anything but. He stood frozen, caught between shame and disbelief, as Jack Reaper Lawson stepped forward. Every inch of the man's frame radiated composure, the kind that doesn't come from arrogance, but from certainty. The rain had soaked through his jacket, tracing dark paths down the leather. His boots splashed softly in the shallow puddles as he walked, each step deliberate, the rhythm echoing against the hum of idling engines behind him. He didn't need to raise his voice. The storm around him, the rumbling of engines, the restless energy of hundreds of bikers standing shoulder to shoulder, already carried his message. When he finally stopped a few feet from the door, he met Tyler's eyes through the glass. The boy's chest rose and fell like a trapped animal's, breath shallow, eyes wide. Jack's tone was even, almost quiet. "You ever mock a widow again?" he said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "You'll be explaining yourself to all of us." The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. They carried the kind of authority that doesn't come from force, but from truth. Behind him, a murmur rippled through the rows of bikers, not a growl but an affirmation, a sound that said, "We stand with this." The power in that silence wasn't in the threat, it was in the unity. Tyler wanted to speak, to apologize again, but the words stuck somewhere between guilt and pride. His throat was dry, his palms slick. Against the counter, he had spent the day believing the worst thing that could happen was being called out online. Now he understood that the real reckoning wasn't digital, it was human, physical, and staring right at him. Jack took one more step forward, just close enough that the reflection of his face blended with Tyler's in the glass. For a heartbeat, they looked like one man, the younger version staring back at the older, one filled with regret, the other with resolve. Then Jack spoke, again softer this time, almost like a father teaching a hard lesson. "You think power's about being louder than someone else," he said, "but real strength, it's about knowing when to be silent and when to stand up." He turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the sea of bikes behind him. "This ain't about vengeance," he said, voice steady and calm. "It's about respect." The words cut through the rain like a sermon. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They understood. There was something sacred in that moment, something that stretched beyond the people gathered there. It wasn't just about a gas station or a poor widow or a stupid, thoughtless insult. It was about the larger truth, the hidden thread that binds every act of decency to another, the invisible chain that keeps humanity from falling apart. Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded bill, slipping it under the edge of the glass door, rainwater immediately soaking into its fibers. "For her gas," he said simply. Then from his pocket he drew out a single red flower, wild, imperfect, fragile against the storm, and laid it on the counter inside the store, visible through the glass. The gesture was small, but its impact was enormous. The symbol wasn't about pity, it was about honor, a recognition that kindness, when expressed with integrity, holds more weight than any punishment ever could. Tyler stared at the flower as though it were a mirror reflecting everything he had done wrong that day. He wanted to reach for it, but something stopped him. Maybe respect, maybe shame. "I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking through the barrier of glass. "I really am." Jack nodded once, not smiling, not forgiving, just acknowledging. "Good," he said. "Then do something with that." His tone was final, like a closing door that still left a path open on the other side. He turned back toward his bike, the rain glinting on the chrome as the storm deepened. The air was filled with the smell of gasoline, wet asphalt, and redemption. Each drop of rain hit the ground like punctuation, marking the end of one story and the start of another. As Jack mounted his bike, the engines around him began to growl again, one after another, until the sound became a single unified roar. Hundreds of headlights ignited the dark, beams slicing through the curtain of rain, illuminating the gas station like a stage under white-hot lights. The reflections bounced off the wet ground, off the glass doors, off Tyler's pale face. For a second, everything was motionless, the riders, the rain, the silence before thunder. Then Jack gave a small nod, not a command, just a signal. The engines responded like a living organism, revving in perfect harmony. The noise was enormous, a wave of sound that felt like a heartbeat for the entire town. It wasn't violence, it wasn't rage, it was a declaration, the sound of solidarity, of moral clarity, of men who refused to let decency die quietly. The thunder of engines rolled outward, shaking the night. Jack's bike led the line, cutting through the rain like a blade. As they began to move, the riders followed in perfect formation, tires carving trails of water through the parking lot. The roar of their departure filled the air, echoing through the empty streets, rattling windows miles away. People would later describe it as a storm, not one of destruction, but of awakening. Inside the store, Tyler watched them go until the last taillight disappeared. Down Route 67, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. The rain softened to a drizzle, tapping gently against the glass, as if the world itself was exhaling. He turned back toward the counter. The $20 bill had slipped partially beneath the door, the ink smudged but still legible. The flower rested beside it, petals glistening with rain, vibrant and alive against the dull countertop. He stared at it for a long time, the meaning sinking in. He picked it up carefully, as though afraid it might fall apart. For the first time in his life, he understood that dignity wasn't something you were given. It was something you protected, for others as much as for yourself. He thought of his own mother, who had worked double shifts to raise him, her hands always rough from cleaning, her patience always long. He had mocked that same struggle in someone else today, and now the realization hit with a force he couldn't measure. "I messed up," he whispered to the empty room, but not again. The storm outside began to drift east, its thunder now distant, replaced by the soft hum of tires on wet asphalt. In the dim glow of the gas station lights, the place looked transformed, not in structure, but in spirit. It had become the kind of landmark stories grow from, the kind that people point to years later and say, "That's where it happened." Farther down the highway, The roar of the engines carried through the night, crossing fields, rivers, and the quiet hearts of nearby towns. People would hear it and wonder. Some would think it was just weather, others would know better. They would sense the weight behind it, the movement of something moral, something human. And in a small house not far from there, Martha Jensen was still awake. She had turned off the lights, but she sat by her window, the rain casting silver lines across the glass. She didn't know what was happening outside, not yet. She only knew that something in the air had shifted, a feeling, a current, as if the world had taken a breath on her behalf. The jar of coins still sat on her table, but tonight it didn't look like a symbol of struggle anymore. It looked like proof of resilience. Back on the road, Jack's face was half hidden by the spray of rain and headlights, but his expression was steady. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He didn't need to. For him, this wasn't victory. It was necessity. Moments like this weren't planned. They happened when people remembered what they were capable of, when they stopped being afraid of doing the right thing. He didn't ride for glory or even gratitude. He rode because sometimes silence isn't an option. The night swallowed the sound of the convoy gradually, like a tide receding into the distance. Behind them, the town returned to its quiet rhythm, but not the same quiet as before. It was the kind of quiet that follows revelation, a stillness that hums with awareness. Something had changed, not in the buildings or the people, but in the collective. Understanding of what it means to be decent, and somewhere beyond the reach of headlights and rain, the story was already spreading, passed from voice to voice, screen to screen, one heart to another. The story of a man who didn't shout, didn't fight, but stood up and made the world remember what respect sounds like when it rides in unison. Morning came to Brooksville soft and grey, the kind of morning that tries to pretend the night before never happened. The roads still glistened from the rain, the smell of wet earth mingling with gasoline in the air. But under that quiet, something had changed. You could feel it, in the way people slowed down at stoplights, in how they greeted one another with an unfamiliar gentleness, like they were all carrying the same unspoken thought. The storm had passed, but its echo was still alive, rolling just beneath the surface. At the Route 67 gas stop, the world was almost still. The neon sign buzzed faintly, reflecting off puddles that had yet to dry. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered over a counter wiped too many times in nervous habit. Tyler sat there, hunched over a cup of coffee gone cold. The shop was empty, but his mind wasn't. The images replayed behind his eyelids every time he blinked. Rows of bikers lined like soldiers, the quiet authority in Jack Lawson's voice, the rain turning every word into something biblical. You ever mock a widow again? You'll be explaining yourself to all of us. He'd barely slept. His phone had buzzed non-stop through the night, first with messages from friends who thought it was a joke, then with ones that didn't. News outlets had already caught wind of the story. One of the local stations called it "The Night the Riders Came Home." The video had gone viral again, this time with the sound of engines layered under emotional piano music, the comments section full of strangers arguing over morality, justice, and the hidden kindness of those the world misjudges. Tyler didn't read most of it. He didn't need to. He already knew the truth. Not the kind people write online, but the kind that hits you when you're forced to see yourself without filters. The door chimed. He looked up, startled. A man in his 40s walked in, oil-stained jeans, calloused hands, the kind of customer who'd been coming there since before Tyler could drive. The man didn't grab a drink or glance at the snacks. He just walked up to the counter, eyes steady. "You're the kid from the video, right?" he asked. Tyler nodded, his throat tight. The man sighed, not in anger but in something heavier. "You got a lot to learn," he said. "But at least now you know where to start." He laid a few bills on the counter, more than enough for gas, and turned toward the door. Before he left, he added, "People don't remember perfection, kid. They remember change. Don't waste it." Then he was gone. By midday, more people had come through. Some didn't say much. They just nodded toward him, their eyes a mix of disapproval and pity. Others stayed long enough to share stories about Martha. "She used to bring my mother groceries after her surgery," one woman said. "Never asked for a dime." Another added, "Her husband built the old Veterans Memorial downtown. Guy had hands like stone and a heart to match." Each story layered over the next, until the picture of who Martha really was became impossible to ignore. She wasn't just a widow with coins in a jar. She was the backbone of a community that had forgotten its own weight until it nearly crushed her. By late afternoon, the gas station owner showed up, a broad man with a fading mustache and a face carved from years of business and worry. He didn't waste words. "Tyler, hand me your keys," he said quietly. "You're done here." Tyler nodded. No argument, no plea. "I know," he said. The owner hesitated, his voice softening just a bit. "The world's watching, son. Might as well give it something better to see next time." When he stepped outside, for the last time, the sunlight had finally broken through the clouds. It hit the puddles and turned them into mirrors, and for a fleeting second, Tyler saw the reflection of the sky instead of his own guilt. Maybe that was how change begins. Not with noise, but with acknowledgement. He stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets and started walking down the road, the hum of distant engines still lingering somewhere in his mind. Across town, the day moved slower, as if everyone was adjusting to a new rhythm. At the diner, people whispered about it between sips of coffee. "Did you see how they lined up?" one man said. "It was like watching order out of chaos." A woman at the counter nodded, wiping down the surface absent-mindedly. "Funny thing," she said. "You think you've seen everything in this world, and then kindness shows up wearing leather." Laughter followed, soft but sincere. Even those who didn't ride, who had once crossed the street at the sight of a biker, spoke with a tone that wasn't fear anymore. It was respect. Martha woke to that same hum, not from engines this time, but from life returning to its proper pace. She moved slowly, her joints stiff, but there was a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. When she stepped outside, the yard was damp, her old truck still parked by the fence. She blinked in surprise. The dents along the side were gone, the rust polished out. Someone had fixed it. A note sat under the wiper, smudged from rain but legible. Respect. "It travels fast. From one rider to another. Keep rolling, Mom." No signature, just a small patch left beside it, a skull with wings, stitched over the words, "Iron Redeemers." She pressed her hand against her heart and smiled, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Frank," she whispered, as if her late husband could hear her. "I think you'd like these men." Inside, she went to the kitchen table where her old coin jar sat. It looked smaller now, less like a symbol of struggle, more like a reminder of survival. She found a small piece of cardboard and wrote carefully in her neat cursive, "Thank you, riders of the storm." Then she placed it in the window for the world to see. All across Brooksville, the story spread not through screens this time, but through conversation. It became something people told each other over fences, in barbershops, at school drop-offs. It wasn't just about the bikers, or the widow or the boy who made a mistake. It was about what happens when humanity remembers itself, when the balance between arrogance and empathy tips in the right direction again. Jack Lawson never read the articles, though his name appeared in more than a few of them. He wasn't interested in the noise. He'd already left town before dawn, the storm behind him and miles of open road ahead. Somewhere near the county line, he stopped at a small diner for breakfast. The waitress poured his coffee without asking, recognizing him but saying nothing. "You were part of it, weren't you?" she finally said, not looking up from her pad. Jack took a sip, the steam curling into the morning air. "Part of what?" he asked, a faint smile touching his lips. She smirked. "The storm," she said simply. He didn't deny it. When he stepped back outside, the horizon stretched endless and gold, sunlight spilling across the road like an invitation. He strapped his gloves, tightened his helmet, and paused for a moment, not to admire the view, but to feel it. There was peace in that pause, the kind that only comes after doing something that aligns with your soul. It wasn't pride that filled him, it was clarity. Sometimes the universe doesn't need words, just actions loud enough to restore faith. He thought of Martha, of her trembling hands steadying as the pump filled her tank. He thought of Tyler, the way the boy's voice had cracked when he finally said, "I'm sorry." He thought of his mother, of all the times she'd said, "Son, never let the world teach you to look away." And he realized. She never meant just the world outside. She meant the world inside too, the hidden places where indifference starts to grow when you stop paying attention. The road hummed beneath his tires as he rode north. Birds scattered overhead, the sky opening wider by the mile. Each turn of the wheel carried not just distance, but revelation, proof that transformation doesn't always begin with the people who've been hurt. Sometimes it begins with the ones brave enough to stop the hurt from spreading. Back in Brooksville, a group of kids on bicycles passed Martha's house and noticed the sign in her window. They stopped, reading it out loud, then grinned. "Riders of the Storm," one said, repeating the words with a kind of reverence. "That's actually kinda cool." The smallest one nodded. "Yeah," he said, "means you stand up for people." And just like that, the lesson passed on, not through speeches or rules, but through example. That's how real change works. It doesn't always announce itself. It lingers quietly, like the scent of rain after thunder. As evening approached, the clouds parted for the first clear sunset in days. The gas station lights flickered on again, steady this time. The wind carried the faint scent of asphalt and lilacs. Somewhere far off, faint but unmistakable, came the echo of a motorcycle, a single engine this time, fading into the horizon. Brooksville had gone back to normal on the surface, but no one could quite shake the feeling that something larger had passed through. Not destruction, not chaos, but a reminder that justice doesn't always wear a uniform, and kindness doesn't always come dressed in white. Sometimes it rides in leather, speaks in silence, and leaves a flower on the counter for those who forgot how beautiful decency can be. And that night, as the lights dimmed across town, Martha sat by her window with her tea, the sign glowing softly beside her. She watched the road, the reflection of her own face blending with the distant headlights passing by, and she whispered to herself, not as prayer, but as truth. "There's still good out there. I've seen it." Outside, the wind carried her words into the darkness, as if delivering them back to the very storm that had brought them to life. The road stretched endlessly before Jack, a ribbon of silver under the fading afternoon sun. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, every surface glistening as though it had been rewritten. The hum of his Harley was steady, a low, faithful sound that filled the spaces between his thoughts. Each mile that rolled beneath his tires felt less like distance and more like reflection, a quiet reckoning between who he'd been and who he was still becoming. He didn't see himself as a hero, and he'd never wanted the word justice attached to his name. What he'd done wasn't about that. It was about memory, about keeping something sacred alive in a world that had forgotten how to bow its head to decency. The air smelled of wet earth and gasoline, a scent that carried the weight of the night before. Jack knew the story had already escaped Brooksville, spreading faster than wind through dry fields. He could almost picture it. Headlines, interviews, people talking about the biker who stood up. But none of that mattered. The internet could build myths, twist them, or erase them. The truth, however, lived in smaller places, in the widow's window with her handwritten sign, in the softened eyes of strangers. Passing one another on quiet streets, that's where the real story took root. He thought of Tyler, the kid who had mocked a woman for being poor, and who had ended up being humbled in front of an entire town. Jack didn't hate him. In a way, he pitied him, not for the shame, but for the emptiness that comes from living without awareness. People don't wake up cruel, he thought. They just stop paying attention. Somewhere between convenience and indifference, they forget that their choices ripple. Outward, maybe now that boy would start to notice the ripples. Maybe that was the whole point. The road curved east, and the light shifted, brushing the sky with streaks of orange and violet. Jack rode with one hand on the throttle and the other brushing lightly against the small patch sewn onto his vest. Iron Redeemers. It wasn't just a name, it was a reminder of who they were beneath the leather and steel. Every man in that group had a story, some darker than others, but they all shared a truth. They had learned the hard way that redemption isn't a single moment. It's a mindset, a lifelong journey stitched together by decisions that no one else may ever see. As the wind pushed against him, he remembered his mother's words, ones she'd repeated through every storm of his youth. Respect is earned, she used to say, but kindness is defended. He hadn't understood it then. To him, respect had meant strength, the kind that comes from being unshakable, from standing your ground. But, now older, carrying the scars that time and life had carved into him, he finally understood. Strength isn't about being untouchable. It's about being willing to protect what's fragile, even when no one's watching. He thought about how the world worked, how small acts carried unseen impact. The hidden truth of every moral decision is that it multiplies. A word of compassion can cross an entire town faster than cruelty ever could. The riders who had joined him that night didn't come for recognition. They came because something inside them recognized itself in that old woman's pain. They came because empathy, once awakened, doesn't sleep easily. That was the revelation that night had given him, that somewhere beneath all the noise, people were still hungry for reminders of their own goodness. They just needed someone to show them that it still mattered. He slowed as he approached a crossroads, the sky above split by the soft glow of power lines. A sign pointed north toward the next town, but he stopped for a moment at the shoulder, cutting the engine. The sudden silence pressed against his ears, heavy and serene. In that stillness, he could hear faint echoes, the laughter of the cruel, the cry of the humiliated, the roar of the engines that had answered. The sound wasn't gone. It had simply settled into the soil, into memory. A car passed by, slowing just enough for the driver to look at him. It was a young woman with her kid in the back seat. She lifted her hand in a small wave, uncertain but grateful. Jack nodded once in return. The gesture was simple, almost meaningless on the surface, yet somehow it filled the air with quiet significance. That's how these things worked. Transformation wasn't loud or cinematic. It unfolded in gestures, in mindset shifts so small they'd be invisible to anyone not paying attention. He looked out at the horizon, at the vastness of the country stretched before him. Endless highways, towns built from stubbornness and hope, people waking every day trying to remember who they were meant to be. They say respect is earned, he murmured, the words slipping through his teeth, carried away by the wind. But sometimes it's defended. He didn't say the rest out loud, but he felt it. And sometimes it's rediscovered. He thought about the bikers who had ridden beside him, men who'd lived through the kind of pain most people never see, veterans haunted by loss, fathers estranged from their families, brothers who'd buried, friends to the road. To the outside world, they were outlaws, but to each other, they were a circle of redemption. Their bond wasn't forged by rebellion. It was born from brokenness. Every scar told a story of someone who'd once taken a wrong turn and decided to find their way back. The engines of that night still played in his mind like a melody. The sound had carried more than noise, it carried purpose. When hundreds of men ride not for rage but for principle, the world takes notice. It was never about fear. It was about presence, a reminder that compassion can have muscle, that decency doesn't have to whisper to be heard. The hidden truth of that night wasn't the confrontation or the viral fame that followed. It was the quiet power of human alignment. People forget how unstoppable good can be when it moves together. He started the bike again, the engine rumbling beneath him like a heartbeat. As he accelerated, the wind tore through his jacket, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt. Each mile marker he passed blurred into the next, the landscape stretching out like an unspoken promise. Somewhere in the distance, other riders were already on the move, Different towns, different roads, same purpose. Not a gang, not a movement, but a mindset. That when the world forgets its heart, someone has to remind it. Jack smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both sadness and peace. He didn't need anyone to thank him, and he didn't need to know what happened next in Brooksville. He knew the pattern well enough. People would talk, the noise would fade, and life would settle again. But beneath that, a seed had been planted, invisible but certain. Someone would see the next act of cruelty and think twice. Someone else would step in before the damage spread. That was enough. As the sky deepened into twilight, he could see his reflection in the bike's mirrors, the lined face of a man who had been both sinner and savior in different lifetimes. He thought about the phrase he'd heard once from an old rider: every man carries two roads inside him, the one he's ridden and the one he's still building. He'd laughed at the time, dismissing it as biker philosophy, but now, as the last light of day faded behind him, he understood it perfectly. The road of redemption isn't something you find, it's something you create, mile by mile, choice by choice, moment by moment. The hum of the engine grew softer as he merged back onto the highway, the horizon pulling him forward. The world around him blurred into a mix of movement and memory. The gas station, the widow's trembling hands, the flour on the counter, the reflection of his own face in the rain. He carried all of it with him, not as a burden, but as proof that even the smallest act can echo louder than cruelty. They say respect is earned, his voice carried quietly into the wind, but sometimes it's defended. And when the world forgets its heart, it takes men with scars to remind us what it means to have one. The sound of his words vanished into the rush of air, swallowed by the horizon, leaving behind only the distant echo of engines. The road stretched on, infinite and uncertain but steady, a ribbon of light cutting through the dark. And somewhere within that dark, the faint glow of compassion kept burning, a reminder that even on the loneliest highways, there are still those who fight for the light. If you made it here, maybe something in this story resonated with you. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when you saw someone do the right thing quietly, or maybe it simply made you believe, even for a second, that kindness still stands a chance. That's the reason this channel exists. To remind us that humanity, in all its chaos, still has light hidden inside it. If this story spoke to you, let me know in the comments with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end." It's my way of knowing you're one of the few who stayed, who felt the heartbeat behind the words. And if that connection meant something to you, don't forget to leave a like. It helps me keep telling stories like this one, stories that might find someone who needs to hear them tonight. And if you want to keep going a little further down this road, there's another video waiting right here, one that carries the same truth, the same quiet power, and maybe the next revelation you didn't know you were looking for. Click there and come ride with me a little longer.